What if I told you that one of America's greatest comedians died leaving behind a mansion worth millions, only for it to become a haunting reminder of fame's darkest side? Richard Pryor's abandoned estate holds secrets that reveal the tragic price of genius, addiction, and the relentless pursuit of laughter through pain. The boy who laughed through hell. Some children grow up in playgrounds and find laughter in cartoons. Richard Franklin Lennox Thomas Pryor found his first laughs in the darkest corners of America, where innocence dies young and survival means learning to smile through the pain. Born on December 1, 1940, in Peoria, Illinois, Richard entered a world that most children never see. His grandmother, Marie Carter, ran a string of brothels and bars in the city's red light district. This wasn't just Richard's neighborhood, this was his home. While other kids played with toys, Richard watched grown men stumble drunk through hallways, heard screams and laughter mixing together in ways that would haunt and inspire him for life. His mother, Gertrude, worked as a prostitute in his grandmother's establishment. His father, Leroy Pryor, was mostly absent, leaving Richard to navigate this adult world with the wide eyes of a child who saw too much, too soon. Violence was as common as breathing in the Pryor household. Richard witnessed brutal fights, police raids, and the kind of raw human behavior that most people never encounter. But instead of breaking him, something remarkable happened. The boy started finding the humor hidden in the horror. By age 7, Richard was already using jokes as a shield. When the other kids at school mocked him for his home life, he made them laugh instead. When the chaos at home became too much, he retreated into characters and voices that helped him make sense of a senseless world. Teachers noticed his gift early. This wasn't just a class clown. This was a natural storyteller who could turn tragedy into comedy, with an honesty that made people uncomfortable and amazed at the same time. His teenage years brought him to local clubs and talent shows around Peoria. Richard would sneak into bars where he wasn't old enough to drink and perform for crowds who had seen it all. But they hadn't seen anything like this skinny kid who could make prostitution, addiction, and street violence funny without making fun of the people who lived it. His material was raw because his life was raw. By the early 1960s, Peoria felt too small for Richard's growing ambition. He had learned everything the streets could teach him about human nature, pain, and the strange way laughter could heal wounds that never fully closed. With barely any money and nothing but talent, Richard made the decision that would change his life forever. He packed his few belongings and headed to New York City, carrying with him the voices, stories, and scars of a childhood that would fuel decades of groundbreaking comedy. The boy who laughed through hell was ready to make the world laugh with him, breaking barriers and finding his voice. When Richard Pryor first hit the comedy circuit in New York City, he looked and sounded nothing like the revolutionary performer he would become. Instead, he wore suits, spoke cleanly, and delivered the kind of safe, observational humor that made white audiences comfortable and club owners happy. For years, Richard followed the Bill Cosby playbook. He talked about everyday situations, avoided controversial topics, and kept his language spotless. Club owners loved booking him because he was talented but predictable. Television producers felt safe putting him on variety shows because he never said anything that would upset advertisers or censors. But inside, Richard was dying a slow, creative death. The material that came naturally to him, the raw stories from his childhood, the honest observations about race and poverty and addiction, all of it stayed locked away. He was making good money performing someone else's version of comedy, but it felt like wearing clothes that never quite fit right. Every night on stage, Richard felt like he was betraying the very experiences that had shaped him into the storyteller he truly was. Then came the night that changed everything. It was 1967, and Richard was performing at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas to a packed room of mostly white tourists. Halfway through his polished routine, something inside him snapped. He stopped mid-sentence, looked out at the audience, and said something that shocked everyone in the room, including himself. He told them he was tired of the act, tired of pretending to be someone he wasn't, and then he walked off stage. That moment of rebellion became Richard's creative rebirth. He threw away the safe material and started performing the comedy that had been burning inside him since childhood. He talked about growing up in a brothel, about racism, about addiction, about the ugly truths that most comedians avoided. Audiences didn't know what hit them. His breakthrough album, released in 1974 and titled with a racial slur that cannot be spoken here, became a massive success despite its shocking content. The follow-up album, Bicentennial, with the same controversial word, proved that Richard had found his authentic voice. These weren't just comedy albums. They were raw, honest explorations of American life from someone who had lived on its roughest edges. White audiences were simultaneously horrified and fascinated by Richard's unflinching honesty. Black audiences finally heard their experiences reflected in mainstream entertainment. Richard had become something unprecedented, a comedian who could make people laugh at the most painful truths about American society. But with this newfound success came new pressures, new temptations, and new ways for a man from Peoria's red light district to lose himself all over again. Hollywood gold and personal chaos. By the mid-1970s, Richard Pryor had everything Hollywood could offer. But success in Tinseltown came with a price tag that would nearly destroy him. His partnership with Gene Wilder in Silver Streak turned Richard into a movie star overnight. The 1976 film proved that audiences loved watching the unlikely duo of the neurotic white guy and the street-smart black comedian. When Stir Crazy followed in 1980, it became one of the highest-grossing comedies of all time. Richard was now commanding millions per film, making him one of the highest-paid entertainers in the world. But behind the box office gold and critical acclaim, Richard's personal life was falling apart in spectacular fashion. His romantic relationships read like a revolving door of chaos. He married Deborah McGuire in 1977, but the marriage lasted less than a year. His relationship with Jennifer Lee was equally turbulent, filled with passionate reconciliations and explosive breakups. Flynn Belaine became another wife in his collection of failed marriages, each relationship ending in bitter court battles and expensive settlements. The money was flowing in faster than Richard had ever imagined, but it was flowing out just as quickly. He developed a cocaine habit that consumed not just his wealth, but his sanity. Friends and family watched in horror as Richard transformed from the brilliant comedian they knew into a paranoid, violent stranger. He would disappear for days on drug binges, emerging gaunt and confused, only to throw money at the problem and dive back into the chaos. His Northridge mansion became ground zero for increasingly disturbing behavior. Richard would host wild parties that lasted for days, filled with drug dealers, hangers-on, and celebrities who came for the free cocaine and stayed for the spectacle. Neighbors reported hearing screaming matches, seeing Richard chase people with weapons, and witnessing police cars becoming regular visitors to the once prestigious address. The contradiction was staggering. During the day, Richard would show up to movie sets and deliver career-defining performances. He was professional, brilliant, and seemingly in control. But when the cameras stopped rolling, he would return to his mansion and spiral into behavior so erratic that even his closest friends started avoiding him. Gene Wilder later admitted that he worried constantly about Richard, never knowing if his comedy partner would be alive for their next project. By 1979, Richard was earning millions per year, but spending even more on drugs, legal fees, and the costly aftermath of his increasingly destructive lifestyle. Those closest to him could see that the success he had worked so hard to achieve was becoming the very thing that might kill him. The question wasn't whether Richard would hit rock bottom. The question was how far he would fall and whether anyone would survive the crash. The fire that changed everything. On June 9, 1980, Richard Pryor literally went up in flames, and the horrific incident would become the defining moment that separated his life into before and after. The days leading up to that night were a blur of cocaine, paranoia, and sleepless terror. Richard had been freebasing for 72 hours straight in his Northridge mansion, convinced that people were trying to kill him. He had barricaded himself in his home office, peeking through curtains at imaginary enemies and talking to voices that only he could hear. Friends who tried to visit were turned away by Richard himself, who was too deep in his drug-induced psychosis to recognize reality from hallucination. That evening, Richard was in his office preparing another hit of cocaine when something went catastrophically wrong. Whether it was an accident with his pipe or a deliberate act during a moment of complete mental breakdown, Richard suddenly found himself engulfed in flames. The fire spread across his body with terrifying speed, fed by the alcohol and drugs in his system. What happened next shocked an entire neighborhood. Richard, still on fire, ran screaming from his house and down Parthenia Street. His clothes were burning, his skin was melting, and neighbors who heard his screams rushed outside to witness a scene from a nightmare. A police officer named Richard Olson was driving by when he saw Richard running while completely engulfed in flames. Olson and several neighbors tackled Richard to the ground and rolled him in the grass, desperately trying to extinguish the fire that was consuming him alive. The ambulance rushed Richard to Sherman Oaks Burn Center, where doctors weren't sure he would survive the night. Over 50% of his body was covered in third-degree burns. His face, hands, chest, and back looked like raw meat. For months, Richard underwent agonizing skin graft surgeries, screaming through procedures that peeled away dead flesh and replaced it with skin from other parts of his body. The physical pain was unbearable, but the emotional trauma of what he had done to himself was even worse. When Richard finally returned to the stage 18 months later with his special Live on the Sunset Strip, he did something that only he could do. He turned his near-death experience into comedy gold. With his characteristic brutal honesty, he told audiences exactly what happened that night, making them laugh at one of the most horrific moments in entertainment history. But even as he joked about it, the scars covering his body served as permanent reminders of how close he had come to destroying everything. The fire had literally burned away one version of Richard Pryor and created another, but the man who emerged from those flames would carry new demons along with the old ones. The Mansion of Broken Dreams. The sprawling Northridge estate that Richard Pryor purchased in the early 1980s should have been his sanctuary, but instead, it became the stage for some of the most disturbing chapters of his life. Sitting on nearly 2 acres in one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods, the mansion was everything a successful entertainer could want. The main house featured 8 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom, multiple living areas designed for entertaining, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with California sunshine. The backyard was an oasis complete with a kidney-shaped swimming pool, tennis court, and guest houses that could accommodate dozens of visitors. But the crown jewel was Richard's personal recording studio, soundproofed and equipped with the latest technology where he could work on material at any hour. In the beginning, the house lived up to its potential as a celebrity playground. Richard hosted legendary parties that drew everyone from Eddie Murphy to Robin Williams to various musicians and actors who wanted to bask in his comedic genius. The guest list also included a darker element: drug dealers, prostitutes, and hangers-on who saw Richard's wealth and addiction as their ticket to easy money. As Richard's cocaine habit worsened, the mansion transformed into something sinister. Neighbors reported hearing screaming matches that echoed through the hills at all hours. Police were called multiple times for domestic violence incidents, drug-related disturbances, and bizarre situations involving Richard chasing people around his property with weapons. One particularly disturbing incident involved Richard firing shots into his own ceiling during a paranoid episode, convinced that enemies were hiding in his attic. The house's multiple rooms became perfect hiding spots for Richard's increasingly erratic behavior. He would disappear into his studio for days, emerging gaunt and confused. Guest bedrooms were turned into drug dens where dealers would set up shop, knowing Richard was too high to notice or care about what was happening under his own roof. The swimming pool area, once perfect for Hollywood glamour, became the scene of violent altercations and overdoses that somehow never made it into police reports. When Richard was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 1986, the mansion began its slow transformation from party central to isolated fortress. As his mobility decreased and his speech became slurred, the celebrity visitors stopped coming. The dealers and hangers-on moved on to easier targets. Room by room, the house grew quiet and empty, leaving Richard alone with his illness, his regrets, and the ghosts of better times. The recording studio where he once crafted brilliant comedy routines sat silent. The pool area gathered leaves and debris. The mansion that had once buzzed with laughter and chaos became a tomb for a living legend. But Richard's physical decline was only the beginning of a financial nightmare that would strip away everything he had worked so hard to build. Multiple sclerosis and financial free fall. In 1986, Richard Pryor received news that would silence the voice that had made him millions. He had multiple sclerosis, a devastating disease that attacks the nervous system and slowly steals away everything that makes a performer who they are. At first, Richard tried to hide his diagnosis from the public and even from close friends. He noticed his hands shaking during performances and his speech occasionally slurring, but he blamed it on his previous drug use or simple exhaustion. The truth was too terrifying to accept. For a man whose entire career depended on his ability to move, gesture, and deliver rapid-fire dialogue, multiple sclerosis was essentially a death sentence for everything he had built. As the disease progressed, Richard's symptoms became impossible to hide. His legendary energy on stage gave way to slower movements and longer pauses between jokes. His razor-sharp timing, the thing that made him the greatest comedian of his generation, began to fade as the disease attacked his brain and nervous system. Walking became difficult, then dangerous. Eventually, Richard would need a wheelchair to move around his own home. The medical bills started piling up immediately. Round-the-clock nursing care cost thousands of dollars per week. Experimental treatments that promised hope but delivered little results drained his bank accounts. Physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy, and a parade of specialists all came with price tags that would have bankrupted most people. Richard was wealthy, but not wealthy enough to fight a disease that had no cure and no mercy. While Richard struggled with his deteriorating health, the vultures circled closer. Business managers, who had once respected his sharp mind, now saw an opportunity to take advantage of his confusion and desperation. Bad investments, sketchy deals, and outright theft began draining his fortune. People who claimed to be helping him were actually helping themselves to whatever they could grab before Richard became too sick to notice. His personal life became equally expensive and complicated. Custody battles with ex-wives over his children turned into legal nightmares that cost hundreds of thousands in attorney fees. Divorce settlements that had seemed manageable when he was earning millions per year became crushing burdens now that his ability to work was disappearing. Each court appearance reminded Richard that his past choices were coming back to haunt him when he was least able to fight back. The man who had once commanded millions for a single movie was now watching his fortune disappear faster than his ability to speak clearly. The disease wasn't just taking away his career, it was taking away his independence, his dignity, and his financial security. But the cruelest twist was still to come, as the people closest to him prepared to wage war over what remained of his legacy. The final years and family wars. By the late 1990s, the man who had once commanded stages around the world was trapped in a wheelchair, his voice reduced to whispers, completely dependent on others for his most basic needs. Richard's Northridge mansion once filled with laughter and chaos, had become a sterile medical facility. Nurses worked around the clock to help him eat, bathe, and move from room to room. The recording studio sat silent and dusty. The pool area was neglected, with equipment rusting and tiles cracking. The house that had witnessed so much life now felt like a tomb where Richard waited for death to finally claim him. But while Richard fought his private battle with multiple sclerosis, a very public war erupted over who would control his care and his remaining fortune. His children from various relationships began fighting with his ex-wives over everything from medical decisions to financial control. Court documents flew back and forth as family members accused each other of neglect, manipulation, and worse. Each side claimed they were acting in Richard's best interests, but the legal fees were eating away at what money remained. The most disturbing mystery involved millions of dollars that simply vanished from Richard's accounts during his most vulnerable years. Bank records showed large withdrawals and transfers that Richard could not have authorized in his condition. Financial investigators suspected elder abuse, but proving it became nearly impossible when the victim could barely speak, and potential witnesses had their own agendas. People who had once claimed to love Richard were now being questioned about whether they had stolen from him while he was helpless. In 2001, Richard shocked everyone by remarrying Jennifer Lee, one of his former wives from decades earlier. The timing raised immediate suspicions among his children and other family members. Why would Jennifer return to marry a man who was clearly dying? Her defenders said it was love and loyalty. Her critics whispered about inheritance rights and control over Richard's estate. The wedding took place in Richard's wheelchair-accessible Northridge home, but it felt more like a business transaction than a romantic reunion. The atmosphere in the mansion during these final years was described by visitors as eerie and depressing. Rooms that had once hosted legendary parties now stood empty, except for medical equipment. The only sounds were the hum of machines and the occasional muffled argument between family members in distant hallways. Richard, when he was awake and alert, could see the greed and conflict swirling around him, but he was powerless to stop it. Friends who tried to visit found it nearly impossible to get past the gatekeepers who now controlled access to Richard. The comedy legend had become a prisoner in his own home, surrounded by people fighting over pieces of his legacy. As 2005 approached, it became clear that Richard's long battle with multiple sclerosis was finally nearing its end. December 10, 2005. At 7:58 in the morning on December 10, 2005, Richard Pryor's heart finally stopped beating at Encino Tarzana Regional Medical Center, ending one of the most brilliant and tortured careers in entertainment history. Richard had been rushed to the hospital the day before when his already fragile health took a final turn for the worse. After nearly 20 years of battling multiple sclerosis, his body simply couldn't fight anymore. The heart attack that killed him was swift, perhaps a mercy for a man who had endured so much physical and emotional pain. He was 65 years old, but looked much older, his body ravaged by decades of drug abuse and progressive disease. Within hours of Richard's death being announced, something ugly happened that revealed just how fractured his family had become. Instead of mourning together, various family members and representatives rushed to secure whatever assets they could claim. Lawyers were contacted before funeral directors. Bank accounts were frozen. Properties were secured. The man wasn't even cold before the people who claimed to love him were fighting over what he had left behind. The public reaction was entirely different and far more genuine. Fans gathered outside comedy clubs across the country to share stories and memories. Fellow comedians called him the greatest of all time, the performer who had broken every barrier and paved the way for honest, raw comedy that changed the industry forever. Eddie Murphy, Chris Rock, and Dave Chappelle all spoke about how Richard had inspired their careers and given them permission to tell the truth on stage. no matter how uncomfortable it made audiences. But when Richard's estate was finally tallied, the numbers shocked everyone who had assumed he died wealthy. His total worth was estimated at around $40 million, which sounds like a fortune, but was far less than anyone expected for someone who had earned over $100 million during his career. Decades of drug addiction, medical bills, legal fees, failed business ventures, and suspected financial abuse had drained away most of what he had accumulated during his peak earning years. The revelation triggered immediate legal warfare. Children from different relationships claimed they deserved larger shares. Ex-wives disputed the validity of recent changes to his will. Jennifer Lee, his final wife, found herself at the center of accusations that she had manipulated Richard during his illness to secure a larger inheritance. Court documents flew back and forth as lawyers argued over everything from the Northridge mansion to royalty rights, from his comedy albums and movies. The comedian who had spent his career making people laugh at life's absurdities had left behind a situation so bitter and complicated that it would have provided material for years of new routines. But as the legal battles raged, questions remained about what would happen to the properties that had witnessed both his greatest triumphs and darkest moments. The abandoned legacy. Today, if you drive through the upscale Northridge neighborhood where Richard Pryor once lived, you'll find his former mansion completely transformed, with no trace of the chaos and brilliance that once filled its rooms. The sprawling estate was sold within 2 years of Richard's death to pay mounting debts and legal fees. New owners gutted the interior, erasing every reminder of the parties, recording sessions, and tragic incidents that had made the house infamous. The soundproof recording studio, where Richard crafted some of his greatest material, was converted into a home theater. The pool area where celebrities once gathered was redesigned with modern landscaping. Even the room where Richard suffered his paranoid episodes has been transformed into a peaceful family space that bears no resemblance to its dark history. His other properties met similar fates. The estate needed quick cash to settle debts and ongoing legal battles, so everything was liquidated. Guest houses, investment properties, and even personal belongings were sold off piece by piece. The family that had fought so bitterly over his assets discovered that there was far less to fight over than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, Richard's artistic legacy continues to grow stronger with each passing year. New generations of comedians study his routines like sacred texts, learning how he transformed personal pain into universal laughter. Netflix specials and comedy documentaries regularly feature his influence on performers like Dave Chappelle, Kevin Hart, and countless others who credit Richard with showing them how to be fearlessly honest on stage. His albums still sell, his movies still stream, and his revolutionary approach to comedy still inspires performers who weren't even born when he was at his peak. But his family continues to struggle with the complicated inheritance he left them. His children have given interviews about growing up with a father who was simultaneously a genius and a deeply troubled man. Some have battled their own addiction issues, seemingly inheriting both his talent and his demons. The legal disputes over his estate dragged on for years, with lawyers ultimately earning more than many of the family members who claimed to deserve Richard's legacy. The most tragic irony is that Richard Pryor, who had earned over $100 million during his career, died with relatively little to show for it financially. His mansion was sold, his fortune was depleted, and his body was broken by decades of self-destruction. Yet his voice, his honesty, and his fearless approach to comedy have proven to be more valuable and enduring than any amount of money. The boy who learned to laugh through hell had become a man who taught the world that comedy could be found in the darkest places, even if the cost of that lesson was everything he had worked to build. His story serves as both inspiration and warning about the price of genius in a world that celebrates talent but often destroys the people who possess it.